career development for practicing anthropologists. And we have Dr. Raul Nolan with us to present on this topic, and we'll have time for some questions and answers at the end of after the presentation, at the end of the program. And we'll also do a brief wrap-up at the end of the program. But without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Nolan to take it from here.
All right, Andrew, thank you very much. My name is Raul Nolan. I work at Purdue University. I'm a professor of anthropology. I'm a social anthropologist trained in the UK. But for most of my career, I've been a practitioner. I was an international development anthropologist for many years in Africa and Asia. And when I came back to the United States, I went into academic administration, which I think is a form of anthropological practice, and was a dean of international programs for quite a few years at several of our larger universities. So I'm going to talk to you today about careers in practice, and let me explain very briefly the title of this, which is First Steps for Anthropologists. This is not baby steps. I know that I'm speaking to a bunch of very professionally well-qualified anthropologists. Many of you have masters and PhDs. But if you have not actually worked outside the university before, or if you're planning to do it full-time from now on, there are a couple of things that I think would be good for us to talk about during the next hour, which will help you get started, which is why I say these are first steps. So let me talk a little bit about the reasons why this is important for all of us. There are, as I've said here, as you can see, there are a lot of opportunities for anthropologist practitioners today, far more than there ever were in the past. And furthermore, the practice world is starting to understand what anthropologists can do for them. And so it is a very rich environment for practitioners. It's also the fastest growing sector of our discipline. And you can see that by looking at all sorts of background documents, which I'm sure some of you have looked at. The demand is increasing all the time. However, as most of you know very well, with a few exceptions, most of our universities don't actually train anthropology students in practice. They don't train them to be practitioners. They train them to be academics. And so as a result of that, some of our best trained anthropologists are actually not that well trained or not that well prepared for the demands of practice, which is why we're having this webinar today, is to start talking about what will it take to get folks who have a very good preparation in anthropology into the world of practice successfully. Let me just quickly outline for you the way I conceptualize this field. This is not talking about what anthropologists do. It's talking about the conditions under which anthropologists work. And I think that's a fairly important distinction. But if you look at the large white oval as our discipline, it is split right down the middle into people who work inside universities and have relatively stable and secure jobs. And by the way, I'm not really talking about adjuncts here. That's a whole other conversation, which we could have, I think, very productively at another time. But for those of us that work in universities as professors, we work under a very specific set of conditions, and we work within a very specific and fairly unusual set of institutions. Within what I would call academic anthropology, there is a subset of folks, many of whom are probably new people, who would be called applied anthropologists. These are people who put anthropology to use in some way or other, usually, although not always, outside the university. But there's a whole other group of people who are out there who are not associated with universities. They make their living independently. They are PhD or MA holding anthropologists, but they work outside. They work for clients, they work independently, and they take care of themselves pretty much. And we call those people practicing anthropologists. So we have these three terms. We have academic anthropology, within which is nested applied anthropology, and then we have practicing anthropologists. Now, effectively speaking, all three of these groups of people often find themselves doing the same things outside. So it's not so much what they do, it's the base from which they operate that distinguishes practitioners from other types of anthropologists. And I think that's a very important distinction that will come up again and again as we talk about this. So let's take a look at what practitioners are like and how they might differ in some respects from people who've had a traditional academic background and are still in the academic life. First of all, academics generally tend to make their bones and get their recognition in terms of what they know, but practitioners are focused on what they can do with what they know. And so there's always that extra step. As my old professor used to say, practitioners have to answer the so what question every day. So it's not just what you know, it's what can you do with that? What's it for? What can we do with it? Second thing that I think distinguishes most practitioners from many academics is a commitment to change. Practitioners are fairly comfortable with the idea that you enter a context or a work environment with the express intention of bringing change and improvement into that situation. And as we well know, our discipline has had a lot of ambivalence toward that in the past, and many of our academic colleagues still have that ambivalence. But most practitioners are actually working for change of some kind or other. And that, of course, has its own ethical implications, and there's lots to discuss there. But you will not find too many practitioners who say, oh no, I'm just an observer here. I'm not here to change anything. Thirdly, practitioners are very much oriented toward client problems and client opportunities. John Van Willigen, who I respect a great deal, said years ago, out in the world, there's no such thing as an anthropology department. There are no such things as anthropological problems. There are only client problems or community problems or people problems. And your job is not to decide, is this really anthropology or not? Your job is to decide, how do I use anthropology to help the client solve the problem? So there's an orientation, in other words, toward other people. And then finally, there's also an orientation toward working with diverse others, other specialists, towards solutions. What Giti Jordan often calls co-thinking. There's an awful lot of collaboration in practice work, whereas, as we know, a lot of our academic colleagues are what we would call lone wolf researchers. They go into the field by themselves, they write up their results by themselves. And although collaboration is starting to creep into the university as a mode of operation, practitioners have been collaborating for years. The way that the environment of practice is structured is very interesting. There are really only 5 or 6 main bases or practice options, and I've listed them here. One is, of course, to be a freelancer. And many of us begin by working independently for ourselves. Some of us, on the other hand, found small businesses and become, businessmen or businesswomen running an anthropological firm. Some of us go and work for the private sector. Some of us go and work for the public sector. Some of us go back into the university, as I did, and work not as an anthropology professor, but as an administrator or as a researcher. And then finally, of course, a lot of people go and they work for nonprofit organizations. So all of these things are what I would call bases, places from which one's paycheck emanates. And that's kind of important because there are important distinctions between these places, but they're all very different from standard university employment. So the characteristics of practice that I think are worth drawing attention to are, as I said a minute ago, this orientation to change and improvement, the focus on clients, the collaboration with others. The other thing that you'll find when you talk to practitioners is every single one of them will say, yes, and I've had to learn a lot of new things, some of them in anthropology and some of them well outside the traditional discipline of anthropology. The other thing that they will tell you is that although they may be doing research from time to time, a lot of what they do isn't just research. And so people who go into the practice world thinking that it's going to be nothing but research are probably in for a surprise. You're expected to do, you're offered opportunities to do many other things than just research. Training, for example, advocacy, for example, policy making, for example. All of those things are things that practitioners eventually find themselves doing. And to some extent or other, we can say that they are either well prepared or badly prepared to do those things, which goes back to the point I made a minute ago about learning new things. They all work inside the context of organizations. They either work for these organizations as consultants or they are actual employees of these organizations. And so they work inside the context of their activity and not outside as sort of observers and, short-term consultants. They're generally speaking engaged in a way that a lot of academics are not. They don't all do the same things all the time. A lot of practitioner career arcs turn into a series of projects, often done for different agencies, different organizations, under different conditions. I once described my own career arc to my students and found to my own surprise that I'd had 12 different jobs, 3 different careers, and work in 6 different countries. And so it was a series of projects. They all built on one another, and you can look back and see the pattern, but it's not the same place, the same work year after year. And that's an important point. The last 2 things I think are really important. Practitioners tend to work on really important things. It's not to say that academics don't, but practitioners are engaged in a way now that they might not have been so much in the past in solving significant problems. We talk about grand challenges, and a lot of practitioners are working on grand challenges. They're working with organizations that are really trying to make a difference with things like humanitarian relief, climate change, energy renewal, that sort of stuff. And so there are real consequences to what these practitioners are doing. And finally, and this is the most important thing, I think, practitioners have responsibility for actually achieving results. People expect them to come in with results. So let's just talk for a minute about results. Results means getting things done. And we talk about this a lot. And in the literature, you'll hear anthropologists discussing things like, what does it mean to be engaged? Well, I have a very simple answer to that. Engagement means getting things done. It means getting results. And when you break that down and you unpack the phrase or the term, this is what I think this has meant to me, at least in my career. First and foremost, solving problems, big ones, little ones, complex ones, simple ones. Secondly, producing actual results. In other words, solving the problem and making it work. Thirdly, getting along with people. And fourthly, helping people to get along with each other. An enormous amount of practice work gets done in organizations with multiple groups of people. And if they're not getting along with each other, part of the practitioner's job is to help them get along and to be able to get along with other people. And practitioners will say, well, that's not really my job. I'm just here to think about this, are missing the point and probably not going to be employed that long, because part of the work is, in fact, keeping things running fairly smoothly. And then the last 2 things, of course, are what characterize organizations these days across the board. Figuring out where to get your hands on resources, figuring out how to use those resources efficiently, and finding better ways to do things in the future. So that's what we mean by getting things done, and that's what practitioners are expected to do. So how do you get hired into a job like this? I have developed over the years a fairly simple 3-step process. You see it there in front of you. Get on the list, stay on the list, and get chosen. It's a little more complicated than that, obviously, and I want to spend a couple of minutes and go through this with you. Getting on the list means basically developing a career vision, getting networked, and then using your network to propel you into what we call informational interview. Once you've done that, you stay on the list and rise to the top by doing an analysis of your strengths and weaknesses, putting together a dynamite resume, doing some more networking, and then finally getting yourself into a position to actually interview. And that's where you get chosen. you interview well, you negotiate your way into the job, and now you have your first practice job. And this works a very different way, obviously, than it does in the university, which is why I think it's good to take a little time and go through this process with you sort of step by step. So let's do that right now. The starting point is your career vision. And I just want to point out a very simple thing. You can look at this later on. We can go back to it if you want to. It's kind of complicated, but not really. Look on the left-hand side, and you'll see values, interests, and skills. The important point I want to bring to you is this. Most of us think of ourselves as professionally defined by the skills that we have, and that's fine. But as individuals, we also have values and we have interests. And I believe, from my experience counseling students and turning them into practitioners, we need to start with values and interests. We need to acknowledge and recognize our own value orientations and our own interests. In other words, things that raise our energy, things that we like to do, things we're curious about. And if we can find a job which responds to our values and our interests, that will keep us going when times get tough. That will keep us on the job. Whereas if we take a job solely because we know how to do the skill set that goes with that job, we may find ourselves in despair. We may find a soul-destroying job or something that doesn't really suit us. Even though we can do the job, we don't like the job. So start with values and interests, because skills can always be learned. You can always learn more skills. And if you take those three things and think about them for a while, you can then derive the kinds of answers, if you like, to what's outlined on the right-hand side. What sort of a sector would you like to work in? Agriculture, education, policy making, manufacturing, advertising? What sort of a setting do you want to work in? Big city, overseas, tropical island? What? Function. What exactly do you see yourself doing here? Is it research? Is it training? Is it consultation? What is it? And then finally, who's going to pay your salary? Back to those 5 or 6 bases that we talked about just a minute ago. Who are you working for? What kind of organization is this? Once you've figured that out, you can start networking. So to look at it a different way, here are the components of a practitioner's job, and I haven't outlined all the things around here, just illustrations. Everybody who works as a practitioner is paid in one way or another, and that's your base over on the left-hand side. The middle is the sector that you're working in general. Is it public administration? Is it manufacturing? Is it international development? What is it exactly? And then within that sector, on the right-hand side, what function are you performing? Are you a manager? Are you a designer? Are you doing evaluation work? Are you doing research? Are you doing advocacy? What is it that you're actually doing? Most practitioners will tell you they move around between these three things all the time. I certainly did. I've worked for governments. I've worked for corporations. I've worked for nonprofits. I've worked for universities. I've done mostly international development, a little bit of work in agriculture, a little bit of work in education, a little bit of work in planning. And on the right-hand side, I've done almost all of these things at one time or another. And you will too, if you go into practice. Okay, so with that in mind, one more thing before we talk about networking, and that is that you already know an awful lot more about how to operate in this new job market than you might think you do. And you certainly know more than most other graduates with advanced degrees. You know how to find relevant data and extract its significance. Why? Because you've been trained to do that. You can pick up the salient points of a local culture in a setting and organization. It's the same as doing field work. You're not daunted by difference. You're not surprised by it. In fact, you like it and you seek it and you're interested in it. You're also very good at asking questions. You're comfortable with ambiguity. All of us who did field work started out knowing very little, and it didn't bother us because we knew that if we just kept asking questions and listening to the answers, eventually we'd figure it out. And in the process, we modified our frameworks as we learned. And you can do that too when you investigate the job market. And you're not just interested in the answers, you're also interested in what the questions are. So it makes you very, very good at going into the job market and figuring out where you should be within that. And I think that watching anthropology graduates do this as opposed to other people trying to do this, the anthropologists are actually much better at it. So you will be too, I'm sure. Okay, so once you've figured out a little bit about where you think you want to be, then you want to start networking. Now, we're all networked to one extent or another, but this is really very focused, very purposive networking, professional networking, I guess I'd call it. And you need to start reaching out to people and making connections with them and using those connections to get things like information and access. So professional networking will introduce you to people that are doing the kinds of work that you would like to do and can be role models or mentors for you. Also, through those people, will provide a lot of information and guidance to you about where to look for jobs and what sorts of opportunities are coming along. You can ask people in your network the kind of what I would call dumb questions that you might not want to ask in a job interview, but that you are curious about, and you can test your assumptions, you can test reality with your network to find out, well, what should my salary expectations be? What kinds of working conditions should I expect? And so forth and so on. And then finally, of course, people in your network can link you to specific individuals inside organizations who may be able to get you a job at some point or other. Now, back to what you already know how to do. One of the things that you'll find is that some of the methods, believe it or not, that you learned in school are going to be helpful to you in the job. And I just picked out 3. Domain analysis. A lot of us know how to do this. This is sort of Jim Spradley's thing. You remember that, participant observation and so forth. Domain analysis helps people figure out how programs are put together, grad school programs, defined and structured and arranged, but also how workplace organizations are defined, structured, and arranged. And you can identify the values and the concepts which compose these organizations, how they're put together, and how people move through them. It's an excellent tool for figuring out how your potential workplace is structured. Second thing, informational interviewing. All of us have done interviewing. All of us are pretty good at it. This will help you figuring out what the questions are to ask, figuring out how to listen to the answers, and how to slot those answers into an emerging framework that you are developing for what kind of a job should you have and where are the opportunities. And then finally, life history analysis is very interesting. Most of us have sat down with informants and gone through their life history and learn a lot. So if you look at the career arc of people in your network, for example, you learn an enormous amount about how they solved various problems, how they saw various opportunities or threats that came up to them, and what they did about it. So all of those things, those 3 things in particular, are very, very useful to you as you find your way through the job market. Right. So at some point, you've done your networking, and you've figured out a little bit about where you want to be. Now it's time to go and find some of those organizations and seek what I would call informational interviews with them. This means researching people online. It means talking to your network a little bit. It means looking around and saying, what kinds of organizations seem to be doing the kinds of things that I would like to do? And then contacting someone in that organization, not the HR department, for heaven's sake, no, but somebody who has project or program authority within that organization. If it's an NGO, for example, doing development work, you want to talk to somebody who's doing, say, the water program in Pakistan, or the mother and child health program in Burkina Faso, whatever it happens to be. Find those people, get in touch with them, either call them up or email them and say, I'm curious about what you do. I'm trying to figure out where I want to be in my career. I'd like to come and talk to you for 20 minutes or so. Would you mind? Would you have time? People like to be asked for advice. Most people, if you ask them politely, will grant you the time. You can do it on the phone. You can do it on Skype. It's probably best to do it in person. Not everybody can do that. But when you get in there, make it clear to them you are not there looking for a job. They all know that eventually you may indeed come to them for a job. But what you are doing right now is seeking advice and information. And they will be willing to give it to you. Whereas if you come at them saying, I'd like a job, they will start thinking, unfortunately, of all sorts of reasons not to employ you. That's just the way the psychology of it works. So go in first with questions in the role of an advice seeker. And most people will give you advice. And when you get in front of them, whether it's on phone, Skype, or in person, ask them 4 things. First of all, what does this organization do and how does it do it? Now, obviously, you've done some work online, you've done your homework, you know a lot about it, so it's not a bald question like that. But say to them, for example, the project that you're doing in Burkina Faso, I've been very interested in it, I've read enough about it, but I want to know more about how does it actually work. So what do you do and how do you do it? Second question, what's it like to work here? Third question, what qualifications do you look for in this organization for the people who you hire? And then finally, and this is probably the most important one, how do you make hiring decisions? Where do you advertise the jobs that you have, and how do you decide? If you come away from an informational interview with answers to those 4 questions, you will know an enormous amount about how to get into that organization when the time comes. But more importantly than anything, you will also know whether you are even qualified to do that kind of work. It may be good news, it may be bad news, but it's all useful information at this point. If you do this with half a dozen or so organizations, you'll get a very, very clear picture of how you stack up in terms of your employability. And at that point, you want to do what we call a SWOT scan. Most of us have done this at some point, or at least know about it. SWOT, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And so you look at your own strengths and your own weaknesses, and you know those better than anybody. So you want to be frank with yourself. I'm very good at this, I'm not very good at that. But now, on the basis of your informational interviews, you also understand something at least about the nature of the opportunities that are out there and the threats that are out there. And so you put these together into a matrix, and you combine your strengths, for example, with some of the opportunities that you've seen, and that generates a set of possibilities which I would call your comparative advantage. These are things you're really good at, and you know you can do those things. If you compare your weaknesses, on the other hand, to opportunities, you have areas where you may choose to make an investment of time, learning new skills, or a divestment. I'll give you a very simple example. Let's suppose that you don't speak French, and you've gone around and you've looked at development agencies, and they've all said, yeah, we really need people who can work in Francophone Africa, so we like to hire people who can speak French. You seem very well qualified in other respects. How's your French? And you go, not so good. So now you have a choice to make. You can either invest in learning French and bring yourself up to standard, or you can divest yourself of that and say, okay, I'm not interested in those kinds of jobs. Matching your strengths against threats, well, that's a question of mobilization. You are already strong here. Maybe it involves brushing up your French. Okay, maybe it involves writing a better resume. Whatever it happens to be, you can do this. You need to mobilize your assets. And then finally, of course, weaknesses and threats. Well, there you may have to do some damage control. That may involve explaining the hole in your resume, why you got fired from your last job, whatever it happens to be. It's not likely to be a huge, big deal. If I were you, I would focus on the comparative advantage, your strengths against opportunities, and possibly doing some mobilization and maybe a few decisions of investment, divestment. Damage control doesn't tend to be a huge deal out in the marketplace. They are interested in what you can do. Once you've done that, you put together your resume. Notice I didn't say a CV. It's not a CV. The CV is the course of your life. And I don't know about you, but I've seen academic resumes that are 40 or 50 pages long. And that is not what we're looking for. Sorry. Got a phone call coming in there. Not anymore. A resume is a brief account of your skills and accomplishments, and I dare say it ought to be no more than 2 or 3 pages at the most. And it really isn't about you. It's about you in relation to another group of people, and it has one purpose and one purpose alone, and that is to get you an interview. Once you have the interview, you can explain in great detail what you can do and all the different things you've done. But the resume is simply to draw attention to you and say, look at me, bring me in and talk to me. Don't you want to do that? So the way you put one of these things together is to go through your past performance and look at your accomplishments. And I'll go back to the point I made at the beginning of this. It's not just what you know, it's what can you do with what you know. That's what they're interested in seeing. What have you accomplished? And so of particular value to most organizations would be things that involve good communication skills, managing teams or projects, being creative, problem solving, having a range of research skills, and of course, getting things done, whatever that happens to be. And almost everybody in their graduate program has done things that fit right into these categories, but it is going to involve some rewriting, obviously, and rethinking of how you present yourself. So the resume is short, it's sweet, and it's focused on accomplishments. Once you do that, you go back to some of these organizations. Now you see you have a resume which is tailored to what they need, to what you heard them say about their organization and about you. And at some point, you will get asked for an interview. And so when you do that, you go in there and all interviews unroll in a different way. Each is unique, really, in many ways, except that all of them are really about 4 questions that they have. And they may not ask these questions directly, but they will try and find out from you 4 things. Why did you come to us? You know, specifically, why are you here? What do you want from us? What do you know about us? Secondly, what do you bring us? What do you know how to do? What are your strengths? What are you good at? Thirdly, what do you like? What's it going to be like to work with you? Those of you that keep tropical fish know that you think carefully before putting a new fish, right, into the fishbowl, because it's an ecology. And they're the same way. An organization is going to bring you in. They want to know, what sort of a fish are you like? How are you going to fit in? What is there anything we need to know about you in order to sort of make a decision here? And then finally, what is it going to cost us? And I'm not talking here about salary necessarily. I'm talking about what else is going to happen. What will we need to provide or change in what we're doing in order to bring you on board? Have you got particular needs, preferences, likes, dislikes, what? And so all of those things are going to be involved in the interview. So be prepared for those kinds of questions. And when you're asked to explain yourself to them, use the same approach that you used with your resume. Pick some of your best accomplishments, and I would pick challenging situations, however you want to define that, and tell them a story for each one. You may not get to talk about all 6, but have 3 to 6 of these things in your back pocket, ready to go. And for each one, tell the story in the following way. Outline what the problem was or the opportunity or the issue that you were presented with. Secondly, describe to them how you approached that. Thirdly, talk about the skills and abilities that you had that you used, right, to approach that thing. And emphasize the anthropology in what you did, because chances are there was a lot of anthropology in whatever you did. And then finally, describe to them the results you got. Although your actions are very central to the story, make sure you include and acknowledge the help that you got from other people, because you don't want them to think that you're a lone wolf or a prima donna. That's not a good idea. And if you can possibly do so, connect everything you're doing to what you know about their own needs. They have needs, they have things that keep them up at night. If you're describing something that you did which gives them the idea, oh, that could work for us, that's made you a very attractive job candidate. Probably the hardest thing for us to do as anthropologists is to explain anthropology to other people. And you are up against people who are not anthropologists, who are competing for the same jobs you are. Lots of people can design surveys, for example. Lots of people can do interviews. Lots of people can be managers or planners or trainers or policy analysts. So what's the value added for an anthropologist? Well, there are lots of different things. Here are some ideas. One is We're the folks that put culture into the picture, and you would be surprised at how many people just don't get that. And you can explain that to people in 30 seconds or less in some cases about why that's important. You also contextualize and integrate things. You look for the broader connections. It's the holism business, but it's also saying, you know, we situate this within its context so that it works better. And we're good at doing that. We're also very synergistic. We work very well with other disciplines. We work very well with engineering and medicine, for example. We help engineers be better engineers. We help doctors be better doctors. And it's not being in a subordinate position. It's being a co-equal, but working very, very well with other people to produce a result that neither discipline could achieve working on its own. And that's a very important point for most people. We are versatile. We're adaptable. We're flexible. We're not just about research. We do all sorts of other things, and we will take on new challenges. We're innovative. We often figure out how to do things because we look at things that other people miss. And finally, we're real good at working with people. We like people. And so we're naturally gregarious, we're friendly, we're curious. All of those things set us apart, I think, from many people who are in the job market. And so I think in addition to whatever else you'd like to tell them about anthropology and about you as an anthropologist, these would be some of the things that I would do. We are just about done. I just want to indicate a couple of things that you might want to look at for further resources. There are very good things on the AAA website, for example. There's a couple of examples right here. There are some books, fairly recent books, that are really good. Sherry Briller and Amy Goldmacher have put together an excellent book on designing an anthropology career. I'd suggest you take a look at that. I would also suggest, especially for those of you with master's degrees, that you look at the Cotapia report, which was authored by Shirley Fisk and a bunch of other people, which I couldn't put them all down here for reasons of space. This is downloadable on the AAA website in PDF format. It's a long report, and it's very interesting, and I would recommend this to anybody who's interested in getting a practice job. Carla Guerrero Montero put together a very nice NAPA bulletin in 2008 outlining careers of various types. Satish Kedia and John Van Willigen did a very nice Domains of Anthropology book in 2005, and I did a couple of books, one a ways back called Anthropology in Practice, which is short and talks about preparing yourself for practice. And the second book, which I edited and had a great deal of help from about 35 other people who contributed chapters, is called The Handbook of Practicing Anthropology. It's a Wiley Blackwell publication. And it's our contribution to what I have started to term a literature of practice. In other words, descriptions of what it's like to be a practitioner written by practitioners. And I think we're getting more and more of this into the literature, and it's high time, and it's very informative. There are some very interesting things coming out, which have, I think, started to change the shape of the dialogue that we have about things like ethics, identity, what it really means to collaborate, what it really means to be engaged. So I'll take a look at those things if I were you. There's one other resource that I did not put on here, which I'd like to give to you, and that is the very excellent website that Paula Chambers runs. It's called The Versatile PhD. If you Google the phrase The Versatile PhD, this website will come up. And this is not an anthropological website, but this is a website for people who have PhDs and want to do something other than being college professors. And she talks about all sorts of stuff, and it's very interactive. They have forums, and you can participate and so forth. Anyway, check it out. I'm going to stop talking. I for once in my life, I've managed to keep to time. I promised 20 minutes for questions back and forth. So I'm going to hand it over to Andrew and let him moderate. And anybody that wants to ask questions or make comments, I would be delighted to hear from you. Thank you very much.
So one question that we have is, do you have any suggestions for anthropologists on how they can answer the dreaded weakness questions? Should they be specifically personal, or should they be framed, or how should they be framed in in your opinion?
Questions about their weaknesses, is that what you're saying?
That was the question.
Well, I think it's always a good idea to acknowledge weaknesses if you have them without sort of letting too many cats out of the bag. I'm not really sure what sort of weaknesses we're talking about, but let's sort of say that let's say you want a job overseas and you've never worked overseas. That's really that puts you at a great disadvantage, obviously, because a lot of my students, for example, and a lot of freshly minted PhDs would love to go overseas and do this or that in some exotic setting. But the plain fact is most agencies won't send you unless they're pretty sure that you've had cross-cultural experience before. So one of the things that you could do would be to think about, well, I've never been overseas, but what have I done in my professional life or ever, which approximates to the kind of experiences that I would have had I gone overseas. What counts, in other words, for cross-cultural experience? And I think most of us would understand intuitively that you can get cross-cultural experience a few miles from home in almost any major American town or city, right? And so if you've spent time working in a culturally different community, if you've spent time working in a high-pressure, high-ambiguity job, the one I always like is to say, have you ever worked on a political campaign? Well, if you have, you've actually experienced a great deal of what it would be like to go and live in, say, Tunisia or Burkina Faso. And so you can bring that into the conversation and in your interviewer's mind, develop an analogy or an equivalence and say, well, no, I've never been to France or Burkina Faso, but I've done the following things, and I think the skills and the insights that I gained from doing that would serve me very well. That's one way to do it. Other kinds of weaknesses, I don't know. Maybe somebody is thinking of a low GPA or something like that. I would have to say that in the world of practice, nobody cares about your GPA. They really care about what can you do. And GPAs might be good for getting into graduate school, but I don't think that people in most of the jobs that I've had really cared very much about what my grades were. I'm having trouble, though, figuring out what other sort of weaknesses we might be talking about here. I mean, everybody's got them, I know that. So if you have a particular example, I'll be happy to talk about it, but I'm kind of out of ideas right now, except to say that you do need to acknowledge these things if they are germane to the job that you're going to do, but try and find something that you already do know how to do, which is a proxy or which is a sort of a substitute for the skill or the experience or whatever it is that you think you lack.
Okay, I think that was a great answer. We'll come through with specific examples if that question asker comes through with specific weaknesses. But another question that's come through is, could you talk about the pros and cons of internships as a step in the career building path?
I have always urged my students to get internships of a very specific kind. And if they're choosing a master's program or a PhD program, let's talk about a master's program first, because I think the internship concept fits very well with a master's program. A lot of times students say, well, I'd like to go on a field school to Mexico, or I'd like to sort of go with my major professor to help him do something in the field. And I said to them, well, do that if it's your heart's desire. But if you're trying to prepare yourself for a practice career, I think what you need to do is seek an internship. And I think it should have a couple of components to it. One is it should probably be in an organization. Now, the organization could be in some exotic part of the world if you want it to be. But since most practitioners work in organizations, this is a great way to get that kind of experience. And maybe this answers another question about the weakness. If you've never worked in an organization before, this is a good chance to do it. So seek an internship that involves you working inside an organization, Secondly, if possible, have that be work on a project. Projects are sort of defined as activities that have specific beginnings, middles, and ends. And projects are usually done for clients, and so you get that kind of an approach too. And thirdly, have it be some kind of cross-cultural activity of some sort. Even if it's in the United States, you can find things that are very cross-cultural. And so if you come out of an internship with solid work for an organization, having worked on a project in an other cultural situation, you are ideally equipped from that point on to go into a job interview and say, yeah, I've had that kind of experience. Plus, it will teach you an enormous amount about how practitioners work and how to work with clients. So that's my short answer. Internships are great.
The next question is related to interviewing, and I wanted to talk a little bit about a bit of strategy for asking questions during the interview process.
Asking questions of them. I think that you ought to go in with some pretty smart questions to ask them. Most interviewers, if they've been doing it for long enough, will sense if you're just making up questions for the heck of it, and I'm sure none of you are actually doing that. You probably do have some really good questions. I would say keep your questions not general necessarily, but keep your questions. Don't start asking questions about how much am I going to get paid and so forth. They haven't made you an offer yet. I mean, there's a whole other thing about negotiating and dealing with offers, and we didn't get into that because I wanted to just take you up to the point of acing the interview. But asking them questions about, what are the most pressing problems that your organization is dealing with right now? What do you see as the future of this organization, and how, if I came on board, how would we all have to change and develop in order to meet the challenges? Those are the kinds of things that I think will indicate to your listeners that you are curious about this organization, you are invested to some extent in its success and in its future, and that you'll be a team player if you join them. So I would think of questions like that, which are about relating you to them. Remember, and this is, I think, one of the other maybe differences between sort of, traditional academics and practitioners. Practitioners, it's never all about me as a practitioner. It's always about me in relation to a group of people. My clients, my coworkers, my organization. So keep your questions focused that way if you can, and I think that will make an impression on people.
Question is related to the value between masters versus PhDs.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about the distinction between those two and what the value is of each.
Sure, and I feel a little hesitant to sort of say what I'm about to say, but I guess I'm going to say it anyway. And here's what I will say right now. In the state of things the way they are, I have a PhD. When I began my graduate school career, I did not want a PhD. I went in seeking a master's degree. I knew what I wanted to do. I was going to become a development anthropologist, and I said, I don't need a PhD to do that. I do need a master's degree, so I'm going to get this and I'm going to leave. And my tutor at Sussex, God bless him, said to me, well, if that's what you really want to do, I'll help you do that. But I would strongly urge you to consider getting a PhD. It will open doors for you later on. He was absolutely right. On the other hand, I went to school in Britain where you go through a much more focused PhD program. It's very different from an American university in most respects. And it doesn't take you nearly as much time, and I dare say not as much agony as getting a PhD out of most of our more prestigious institutions here. So I kind of hesitate to say to people, oh, go ahead and get the PhD, because as you probably know, the average time from the bachelor's degree, from the time you get your bachelor's degree, the average time to PhD for social science and humanities is something like 12.4 years. Now, not everybody takes that long, but that's the average. And so some people are taking a lot longer. You may want to think about that. My My advice to students today is find a good master's program, find an applied master's program, get the master's degree, leave the university, go out, get some work for a couple of years, then come back. Because when you come back, you'll know a couple of things that you probably don't know now. One is you'll know whether you want a PhD in anthropology or whether you actually want an MPH or an MBA or a PhD in something else. Number two, you'll also understand at that point why you need the PhD, and it will make you a much better, much more focused PhD student. So I think everybody wins. I think the program that you join wins. I think you win. And if we're talking about people in their sort of, mid-20s, early 30s, taking a couple of years and going into the workforce gives you an excellent appreciation of whether practice is for you or not. So I would say do the MA. I know I'm going to take, criticism for that for some of my colleagues who think that the PhD is what defines us as anthropologists, but I personally do not believe that. I think that today what's happening is we're seeing that people can be anthropologists, they can be excellent, successful practitioners with a master's degree. And that's been a wake-up to the profession, or to the discipline, I should say.
Okay, so the next question is, would you recommend the same sort of process for finding consultancies, meaning an applied anthropologist is not ready to fully leave the academic world?
Yeah, I would. Getting consultancies is, in some cases, fairly easy. I'm not going to overemphasize the ease with which it can be done, but under certain conditions, it's very easy to do. One of the things I didn't get into in the webinar is the distinction between what I would call technicians and managers. And technicians are people like us, anthropologists, who have very specific skills. And you can get hired as a consultant because you have a very specific skill. What would those skills be? Well, it might be a methodological skill. You might be an absolute whiz at factor analysis or regression analysis or using a particular, software program or something. You may be an expert in some remote part of the Amazon basin. You may be the only language speaker in a group of people going out to design a major project. That was actually how I got a couple of my early consulting jobs. I was the only guy who could speak not just French, but a couple of Senegalese languages. And so they said, oh, yeah, we need somebody on the team who can do that. Nobody else could do that. And so, I always tell my students, language is great. Language is very useful. In that case, you're being hired as a technician. You're being hired because of one or two really exceptional abilities. If you do your SWOT analysis and you identify things like that, I would say, if you feel like doing that kind of work, go and get a couple of short-term consulting jobs. Why? Because it's an excellent way to see whether you really like practice or not, number one. Number two, it's a great way to see different places and look at different sort of work styles and organizations. But three, and this is the most important thing, it's an excellent way to get networked. Everybody in the consulting business, it's a very small world, and they all know each other. And once you're in that network, if you've done a good job for people, you'll keep getting work, and some of that work will then turn into long-term work. So it's a good thing to do.
So the next question is, what challenges would you anticipate for someone seeking employment with a company that's never worked with anthropologists before?
That's never worked with anthropologists before. That's a very interesting question. I don't know how to answer that, except that there's a good side to that, right, and a bad side. The good side is if you're the only anthropologist that they have ever thought about hiring, you kind of get to define the terms, don't you? You get to tell them what anthropology is. And that's exciting. I mean, that's a good opportunity for you to think carefully before you go in there and say, this is what I'm going to tell them about anthropology. And so you get, as it were, to initiate them into the discipline. And I think that's exciting. Now, it's hard work, obviously. and without knowing what kind of a firm you're going into, but let's just say it's an engineering firm, all right? If it's an engineering firm, then you know, don't you, that these are empiricists. These are people who, it's all about math and so forth. So you're going to need to describe what you do, not in opposition to that, but rather as an assist to that, as a synergistic addition to their team or their workforce. So that's exciting. You can do that. The downside, of course, is that, they may not know a lot about it. They may have this image of, I don't know what, Jane Goodall, Indiana Jones, and Margaret Mead in their heads, or worse yet, Temperance Brennan, right? And most of those people aren't, some of them aren't real, and the others aren't really anthropologists. I mean, not the kind that we are. So you do have a bit of a problem there, I agree. But I'm reminded of what Ted Scudder used to tell me. Ted Scudder, some of you probably know Ted. He works out at Caltech in Pasadena. He's the only anthropologist in this top flight engineering school. And he says, it's wonderful. I get to be Mr. Anthropology to all these engineers. I'm the guy who tells them, how important this is. So it's an opportunity, but it's hard. So think carefully, in other words, about how you're going to do that.
Okay, so we have time for one more question, and
Sure.
that is, are there certain practicing jobs that make it more difficult to transition back to the academic world?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I'm very glad somebody brought that up. I've been thinking about that myself, because I did transition from practice into academia, and I have a few friends who've done that. And I'm thinking of trying to write an article or something about how that's done by drawing together, 3 or 4 people's stories. Here's what I would tell you. It is unusual for practitioners to find their way back into anthropology departments, but it is not impossible. And there are a number of well-known people, and I won't mention them by name, but I mean, there are people out there, and anybody wants to email me, I'll be glad to tell you who they are, who've done this successfully. The thing you have to keep in mind is that the academy still, and this would include, I think, almost every university that I know anything about, has these very rigid and very out-of-date policies for recruitment, promotion, and tenure. And they emphasize scholarly performance, scholarly achievement. So this means that if you are a practitioner, what you need to do is you need to write. You need to publish. You need to go to the SFAA meetings or the AAA meetings. You need to be seen. You need to present. You need to do the things that academics do. You don't have to do it quite as intensively as they do. But if you try and get a job at a university with 20 years of practice experience and no published books and only 2 or 3 published articles, you will not get a job, no matter how good you were as a practitioner. And that is a very sad fact, but it's true. I only know of 1 or 2 universities that would even consider employing somebody like that. The people on the committee would look at that and say, well, certainly had an interesting career, but not a scholar, and therefore not worthy to be one of us. I find this deplorable, and I think the sooner it changes, the better, but it's not going to change anytime soon. It may change in the next 10 years or so, but I wonder. So, if you're going to be a practitioner, make sure that you are writing up what you're doing, getting it published in, say, Human Organization, Practicing Anthropologist, which is not refereed, but still it's pretty good, and a few other places, and you'll be okay in that case. But you really do need, if you're going to go and be with the other ducks, you need to look like a duck and walk like a duck and talk like a duck to some extent. Otherwise, they'll say, no, not one of us. It's a very tribal thing, basically.
Okay, so that was our last question. And I just want to say a big thank you to all of our participants, and especially to Dr. Nolan for a great presentation today, very informative. And just to satisfy a lot of the questions that we've seen, we will be having this webinar available on our website after the presentation. And the PowerPoint presentation will be available on our website as well. And
very good.
Just to kind of give a little bit of information, our next webinar is going to be on February 19th at 2 p.m. Eastern, and it's going to be on the topic of recruitment and retention of underrepresented minorities into anthropology programs, and we're looking forward to that as well. So thank you to everyone again.
All right, thank you very much.